Okay, welcome everybody to this episode of the MirYam Institute podcast. It's the Israel Monthly Brief hosted by me, Benjamin Anthony, co-founder of the MirYam Institute, together with our in-host analyst Yaakov Lapin, and Shana Tova to all of you who are listening. Happy New Year, Ometuka, and a sweet one at that. And Yaakov, Shana Tova to you and to your dear family. How are you doing, first of all?
Shana Tova. I'm doing well, thanks. I'm coming back into this New Year's backlog of work, but other than that, doing very well.
Yeah, it feels like it should still be the weekend here in Israel somehow, don't you think?
Yeah, definitely. Or if not, then it should at least be clear to everybody that everybody's phasing back into work and not jumping into an avalanche.
You say that as though it's not clear to everybody. You're giving yourself away here, Yaakov. You've got
no. I think that you got the subtext exactly right.
Okay, good. Well, I wish you luck with that. Good luck.
Thank you.
Good luck convincing them. So I want to begin with something a little bit different now for our listeners. Every month, Yaakov produces basically what's a digest of some of the big stories emanating from the states of Israel for your consideration. It's placed on the MirYam Institute website, which you can see at our homepage and also in the commentary section. And I recommend it very, very highly to all of you and to anybody who's interested in a bite-sized overview of some key events from over here. But I don't actually want to use that as the basis for our conversation today, Yaakov, if that's okay. I want to instead talk about something else, which was a conference that I attended last week. Now, last week, I was present during the annual ICT conference. ICT stands for the International Counter-Terror Conference, and it's hosted at Reichman University. And I was a guest there, Yaakov, because our organization, the MirYam Institute, sponsors once a year, every year, a visiting lecturer from the United States who's expert in national security matters and who can present the American viewpoint to a greater or lesser extent to the students at Reichman University. And they teach a 2-week course sometimes, and we're looking at a semester-long course coming about in the very near future. And as a consequence of that relationship, which is something we're very proud of here at the MirYam Institute, as a consequence of that relationship, I am invited together with my colleague to the annual conference. And the speaker that I went specifically to hear on 9/11, as we commemorated the atrocities of September 11th, 2001, was none other than Yoav Gallant, the Defense Minister of the State of Israel. Now, before I get into some questions about what Gallant actually said, which I know that you will have studied carefully and I know you'll be very, very familiar with and can add a lot of context to, I'd like you to please take a moment to tell us who Yoav Gallant is beyond his title and his current position, as I mentioned, as Minister of Defense. Tell us about his background, Yaakov, if you would, and tell us some of the things that might make this man a little bit unique.
Well, I think, the most interesting thing to note about Yoav Gallant is, first of all, he is in a position in which he has to carry out basically an impossible balancing act. And in doing so, he's basically balancing against the interests and needs of the defense establishment on the one hand, and the government, of which he is such a prominent member, on the other. And his great familiarity with the defense establishment and the trust that he appears to garner from defense chiefs is only possible because of his lengthy service. This is somebody who was a former head of IDF. He has decades of military service behind him. He was a commander of the Shayeta 13 commando unit. He was a commander of several elite units. And all of these roles basically set him up to lead the current defense establishment in its most precarious and sensitive situation that one can imagine. So, it's his very lengthy service in the military that, without him knowing it at the time, set him up to represent that military to a government, which parts of that government are in a headlong clash with that very same military. And I think that's actually the most important thing to know about him right now. And then, we can look at the fact that he was a candidate to become the IDF chief of staff, and that candidacy was, ended up being rejected because of a dispute over land in his home in the north of Israel. He has all kinds of attempts to enter the political system, attempts that didn't really take off until more recently. But his military career is very different from his political career. His military career is really one of a distinguished service. As I've mentioned, commander of Sha'etzet 13. This is the naval commando unit. And then he commands the Gaza division. He commands some armored divisions. And really, what I remember him most for is his command of IDF Southern Command, which is responsible for the Gaza Strip, as well as for the Sinai Arena. During his time, the IDF embarked on Operation Cast Lead against Hamas in 2008, 2009. Gallant himself personally commanded that operation. So, he's got this very lengthy military career. I don't know all of the posts along this career, but certainly he is a military man, a security services figure, somebody who comes from the depth of the military, somebody who was supposed to be the IDF chief of staff, and now finds himself as a civilian at the very top of the defense establishment, as I've said, during its most sensitive period when it comes to dealing with this current government.
Yeah, and Yoav Gallant, of course, could be said to be gallant by name, gallant by nature. He's a fierce commander of troops in the Israel Defense Forces, known for his bravery, known for a great and personal relationship with none other than Ariel Sharon, who's also an erstwhile prime minister of the State of Israel. But there's a little bit of a parallel there, which is that Ariel Sharon was, of course, a great general, but a little bit controversial and never actually became the chief of the general staff. And there was a famous maxim about Ariel Sharon, which said that those who do not want Ariel Sharon as chief of staff will receive him later as Minister of Defense, and those who do not want him as Minister of Defense will receive him later as Prime Minister. And all of those various steps actually came to pass. Now, Yoav Gallant did not become chief of the general staff, though he was initially nominated for it due to some controversy about land and zoning and building in his own private territory and the question of whether it was beyond that territory or not. And here he is now as defense minister, as Minister of Defense, which is one of the most important positions, obviously, in the state of Israel. And I watched him, Yaakov, wondering, is his next trick that he may become Prime Minister of the State of Israel? And I'll tell you why I'm interested in discussing this with you, because he's obviously holding the position as Minister of Defense within a Likud government as a member of Knesset in the Likud party, which of course is helmed by Benjamin Netanyahu. And he came out and he put forward 4 points for the consideration of the audience. I was sitting there in either the second or third row. I was very, very interested in what he would have to say and became more interested as he said it. And he established 4 priorities for the state of Israel to pursue. And not only did he establish 4 priorities, but he didn't do so in an arbitrary order. There was a specific order saying top of the list is this, lower down is that, and so on and so forth. And basically everything else must wait. That's what he said. Now, for him to do that as Minister of Defense in a Likud government is controversial, because what was absent his list of priorities was the need for judicial reform, which is something that has gripped this country since basically Prime Minister Netanyahu returned to the position of Prime Minister following our most recent elections here. So I want to go through the 4 points for you, Yaakov. He said, number 1, security. Obviously, the state of Israel must preserve its security, and top of the list in that preservation is countering the threat from Iran, specifically with regard to its nuclear weapons pursuit. The second priority was normalization, specifically with regard to the Saudi Arabian kingdom, and he emphasized that within that process of potential normalization was the vital importance of the defense establishment scrutinizing as closely as possible all of the security implications of any such normalization, because And like the normalization that we had with the UAE, the Saudis seek to have a civil nuclear energy program, which does bring a certain degree of concern, not only to the State of Israel, but to everybody in the region as well, because of the more simple conversion process that can take place from a civil nuclear program to a military nuclear program, then can take place in the total absence of any nuclear program of any kind or sort whatsoever. The third point for emphasis was the preservation of a strong economy here in the State of Israel, which he emphasized is contingent upon our continued ability to innovate, our continued ability to stay ahead of the global curve in the area of technology, and most importantly, Yaakov, our continued ability to retain the best among us here in the State of Israel. And what he was alluding to, in my opinion, was the potential that we are hearing of, that some of our innovators, some of our entrepreneurs, some of our leaders in the tech sector are looking abroad as a potential move out of the State of Israel, maybe in the near future, in the event that judicial reform goes ahead. And he's very, very concerned about that in general, but also because it would, in his estimations, I believe he was saying, it would bring us to a position where the best among us in those sectors, the tech sectors, might look to make their homes in countries other than the of law and order, specifically with regard to the horrendous violence that's taking place in the Arab sector here in the State of Israel. So let me ask you, do you agree with his priority set?
I think, before I answer that, it's worth pointing out, at least the way I interpret these priorities. Why is he even calling for these priorities at this time? Because according to Gallant's understanding, and not just his, the whole of Israel's ability to function and defend itself in this hostile region and to achieve what we call, I guess, defense supremacy and a very high functioning economy and technology and all of the ingredients that make Israel both feasible and prosperous in the Middle East, all of this rests on people. And what Gallant is concerned about, and what you alluded to in your question, is that if we lose a minimal degree of national cohesion and unity, we're going to lose our people. And that holds true for the military, and that holds true for the economy. And those are two sectors where Israel cannot afford to lose its best people. A lot of countries have good fighter jets, and a lot of countries have, really good submarines and missile systems. But most of them, and I say this, without knowing every country as a case study per se, but I believe that few countries have the level of personnel and excellence that Israel does when it comes to operating those systems, finding very innovative and creative ways to use them, and most importantly, the dedication of these people to show up for reserves, for example. Without our reserves model, the IDF would be a very small percentage of its full size. And the IDF can't build a full standing army that's always at its full capacity because of the size of its population. So the reserves model rests on people, the excellence of the IDF, and everything to do with the economy and the tech scene and everything that makes Israel in 2023 the country that it is. So I think that Gallant is putting these priorities down as a way to jolt everybody on both sides of the political divide. And he specifically said in that speech that you mentioned, I'm not going into who started it, which was, interesting considering the fact that he himself was in the government, but I'll stay clear of politics. And he is saying, if we don't get our house in order, we're going to lose our people. If we lose the best of our people, we're not going to have the military, the economy, and the tech scene that we do. And I think that this is the overall prism through which we should understand Gallant's comments. It was really a call. I don't know if we can call it a call to arms, but it was a wake-up call. He's ringing the bell, and he's telling everybody, without a broad consensus, don't do anything. And that call was going out both to his own prime minister, to the right, also to the left, to everybody. And I think, that's the basics. That's the premise. As for the priority list that he delivered, I thought it was very interesting. He put defense, as you say, at the top, and I made a note of these priorities myself. And certainly, he's right. If you're asking me what my opinion is, he's absolutely right to put defense at the top, because we need to understand, and sometimes we here in Israel even need to remember this, that without defense we have nothing. People want to talk about an education budget, which is vital. Without defense, if we have missiles raining down, there won't be any schools. And people want to talk about health, which of course is critical for everybody. Again, if we have missiles and terrorists running wild here, and we can look at the numbers of terror attacks that are thwarted every year, it's between 400 to 500. So that's, 1 to 2 a day. Without these basic levels of defense that Israel currently enjoys, we won't have anything else. Not an economy, not education, not health. So defense is the premise for everything, and that's why Gallant is putting it at the top. We discussed in our previous podcast, I think, the potential ramifications of a Saudi normalization agreement. I think it's huge strategically. When we look at the Middle East and the map of the Middle East, getting Saudi Arabia to join Israel officially will have huge implications for the ability to contain Iran, militarily, economically, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that's why he put it second. I would also remind everybody that Prime Minister Netanyahu himself listed normalization with Saudi Arabia as one of his top 3, I think, objectives when he came to power. And what were the other 2? One was about security from a criminal perspective, from a policing law enforcement perspective, right?
Yes,
and that's of course absolutely true.
A return of law and order.
Return of law and order, yeah, absolutely. I mean, we have gun crime and violence, organized crime, clan-based crime. All of that is absolutely running wild in the Arab-Israeli sector, which is having a direct knock-on effect on the rest of the country. This is a real crisis. It's an epidemic. The number of people being killed by crime in the Arab-Israeli sector is just alarming, disturbing, cannot go on, and has a direct implication on the security of the country. And also, terrorists and hostile actors like Iran are actively taking advantage of that situation, trying to get guns into criminal hands, because they know that the border between criminal organizations and terrorists is very fuzzy. So this all has a very negative effect, and I agree with Gallant for putting that onto his list. And there's one more that we missed. Perhaps you've got it in mind. I think it was number 3 on his list.
Sure. Number three was that the security of the states of Israel is contingent upon a strong economy, and that economy, as you mentioned earlier, is contingent upon the best of Israel remaining involved and engaged in its continued technological advancement, innovation, and entrepreneurialism, for which it's become fabled around the world. And his concern is that with the internal strife, that's begotten by the judicial reform, some of those who he identifies as the best among us, and I want to mention very, very clearly, in that sector. In other words, he's not saying innovators are by definition the best of what Israel has to offer. He's saying that within that sector, the best innovators are looking at moving away, because he emphasized that in order for people to innovate, in order for people to push the boundaries of what's possible, you first of all need stability internally.
Absolutely. And also, when we look at our defense budget, which is huge per capita, when you compare it to other countries, how are we supposed to pay for a defense budget like this if we don't have an economy that's prospering, that's attracting investment, that's creating, a level of GDP that will enable us to pay for our military and security needs? With all due respect to American assistance, it's not going to foot the bill. Israel has to pay for the vast majority of its own expenses, and these are very, very considerable. So without the highly functioning economy based on this kind of technological innovation, the high-tech scene, which is really the steam engine that's leading the rest of the economy in terms of income, taxes going into the state, etc. Without that, we're not going to have a 21st century military. So everything is really linked to everything. I mean, I think that this is a correct strategic view that Gallant is putting forward here. I agree with him.
Now, you're a man who hates politics, or at least speaking about politics on this particular program, but I know that you are very, very politically savvy and very politically aware. Let me ask you a question. Is Yoav Gallant's position tenable, given the fact that the government of the State of Israel is emphasizing judicial reform, judicial reform, judicial reform. He, as Minister of Defense, I really want us to hit this point for our listeners. He, as Minister of Defense, which is the most significant position for anybody to hold after the position of Prime Minister of the States of Israel, certainly in the States of Israel, he is saying publicly, wait a minute, there are 4 other priorities here, and quite frankly, this emphasis on judicial reform, that has to wait because we are losing sight of our priorities. Can such a defense minister remain in situ? And is this 4-point platform actually, Yaakov, potentially a manifesto for a run at the premiership?
So I definitely don't know about the second clause of your question, but in terms of his tenability, well, let's remember that he was fired at the end of March 26th, I think it is, by Prime Minister Netanyahu, because he issued a public warning then, which was pretty similar to what he's saying now, but I guess less detailed, and he didn't have the advantage of time to see, how divided the country would go on to be. But he issued the warning that he issued. Then he was fired. Then that sparked nationwide protests. If you recall the scenes all over the country, highways and streets were filled with demonstrators. And then Netanyahu retracted the firing of Gallant, and then he came back into the government. I would say that Gallant's popularity among the anti-reform camp has dropped significantly since that time, because he did vote in favor of canceling the reasonability clause without getting into that entire affair. But since he did that, he, according to reports, when he voted with the government at that time, he felt like if he voted against the government, he would be using his last bullet. He feels like he has one last bullet, quote unquote, left to publicly break ranks with the government, and he wants to wait to make sure that there's really no alternative before he does that. So to answer the question of tenability, all of it depends on what the government does. If Prime Minister Netanyahu and the government basically stop here when it comes to judicial reform, then I think his position is tenable. If they continue and try and pass, many more controversial clauses of this reform, then his position will become untenable. And I think even if you just look at the military situation, the ramifications, because, we have a people's army, this is an army of citizens, so it's not really possible to disconnect the political crisis from the military. And I'm saying all this without getting into the important argument about whether the military, whether reservists should or should not be weighing in as reservists, because, there are valid points to be made here about the fact that reservist jobs, the job of a reservist and the job of anybody who's involved in the military is to defend the country, period, and fight your political battles as a civilian, clear separation. There is merit to that argument, but nevertheless, we're discussing things that are happening, not things that should be happening. So we have, thousands of reservists, and the exact number is no longer known. But, in July, it was well over 1,000, and I'm sure that number has grown. Hundreds of Air Force reservists and people from the intelligence world and special operations saying that they will no longer show up for active duty if they're called upon because of this judicial reform program. So if the government continues with this, more and more people will likely follow that trend. And I think that would make Gallant's position untenable almost by definition. And for that reason, even if you look at that reason alone, I think that's enough of a reason to make Prime Minister Netanyahu hit the brakes. I don't think Netanyahu is interested in seeing a crumbling of the reserve forces. And even if you isolate this factor and just look at that and nothing else in terms of fallout, that in itself was probably enough to make him hit the brakes, in my opinion. So we'll see what happens, but I think that his situation right now is tenable because the chances of Netanyahu pushing through, the judicial reform in its larger form seems unlikely at this time.
Well, I have to tell you, I interviewed Yoav Gallant back in 2017 in the Knesset during one of our delegations to Israel for graduate students. And to be perfectly frank with you, he was boring as all hell. He didn't really seem to be a man of great interest whatsoever. But I can tell you, listening to him at the conference at Reichman University last week, I found him fascinating. I think he's grown into his role. I think he's done so gradually. I think he's done so in a very calculated, and I mean that in a positive sense, a very calculated way, in a manner that we actually don't typically see with too many high-ups in the military who move over to the political sphere. They tend to move from their senior rank, even as high as the chief of staff, right into the political realm, and as they do so, they put at the top spot their ambition to become prime minister of the state of Israel. And many of these individuals flame out, quite frankly. Gallant did it in a bit of a different way. Gallant came in, kept himself a little bit beneath the radar, maybe informed by his experience as a commando in the Israeli Navy SEALs, learned the ropes, learned politics, took on a couple of positions that he probably didn't really relish holding, probably weren't of interest to him, certainly not to the extent that the portfolio of being Minister of Defense is at this time. That's the one that he seems to have been crafted and built and molded for. But I actually think that what I was seeing there was a man laying out his bona fides as a potential prime minister. I'm not saying he will be a prime minister. I don't know whether he has the popularity to become a prime minister. I also think he faces a real challenge. You mentioned from within the protest movement. I don't think he's actually seen as a true Likudnik by the Likud base, quite frankly, in the way that some of the other prominent members of Likud are. But he has evolved and he's developed and he's advanced. And I think that he's actually a bit of a beacon of hope for me, Yoav Gallant, at this time, in that he is willing to stand up and put out a very clear call. He's doing it in unambiguous terms when he says, look, these are our 4 priorities. Yes, I'm here in the government helmed by Benjamin Netanyahu. Yes, I am a Likudnik today. I mentioned today, of course, because he didn't come to the political sphere through Likud. He came to the political sphere through a now defunct party named Kulanu, which was actually quite a short-lived presence on the political map. But he's saying very, very clearly, I am the Minister of Defense, I am under Prime Minister Netanyahu, I am a member of the Likud, and I'm saying our priorities are off right now. Our governmental priorities are off, and anybody who tells you that the judicial reform is the #1 priority is seminally wrong, because actually there are at least 4 priorities, those that I've delineated already, Yaakov, that need to take primacy over and above judicial reform. And when you have a Minister of Defense who's willing to come out and say that in those terms with unique qualification, right? He premised his comments by expressing that he walks among defense establishment figures from some of the lower ranks to the senior ranks, and he listens to these people. He has a listening ear towards them. He obviously has an affinity for them, given his own background. He is saying, listen, we really need to focus back in, and we really, really need to get this right. And in order to do so, we need to put judicial reform basically on the back burner. So to me, that's fascinating. It's interesting. And I wonder if we're getting an insight into Gallant's ambitions himself as a politician in Israel. I want to change.
We're certainly seeing his self as, or 2 words, it would be gatekeeper.
Gatekeeper, yes, absolutely, absolutely. Shomer HaSaf, as we say in Ivrit, the gatekeeper. And I want to change gears a little bit with you, Yaakov, now, move on to a different topic, which is also from Yoav Gallant's speech. He made mention of the potential normalization between the Saudi Arabian Kingdom and Israel, brokered by the United States of America. And he characterized it as obviously being tremendously significant, that it would be, speaking of gateways, a gateway to normalization with the Muslim world and the Arab world, or much of both of those worlds. But he then categorized that, talking about outlining a list of priorities. And he said that normalization with the Saudis would be secondary only to the peace agreement signed between Israel and Egypt, brokered by the Carter administration. Just wanted to talk about that because we're soon going to be commemorating the Yom Kippur War. The Yom Kippur War is the war that preceded the historic peace accord between Israel and Egypt. Why is Gallant saying it would be secondary, in your opinion, to that peace accord? Normalization with the Saudis, secondary to the peace accord with Egypt and Israel. I know what I think, but I want to hear from you.
Okay. Perhaps what he meant here is that Egypt, being the country, the Arab Muslim country, the first one to come out of the zone of hostility and into the zone of cooperation with Israel, breaking that, unified Middle Eastern map of hostility, which was an enormous step at that time, and actually remains an enormous step. And, Sadat paid for that step with his life. So perhaps, he sees that as the most significant, the trailblazing step, the pioneer. And here, though, I think, with the Saudis, he's hoping for so much more, because while Egypt's and President Sadat set a precedent which continues to reverberate to this day and strategically was enormously beneficial to both countries. Just the fact that they don't have to worry about going to war with one another has saved them so much, countless resources that they can dedicate to other needs and their security cooperation. But there hasn't been normalization at the societal level. And I think, with the Saudis, there's a real hope here in the long term, medium to long term, that we could actually get normalization between Israeli and Saudi societies as well. And that means, civil cooperation on joint economic initiatives, technological initiatives. I could envision, Saudi money being invested in Israeli high-tech startups. That would be a phenomenal level of cooperation. I could see Israeli high-tech companies playing a role in NEOM, the city that Saudi Arabia is building on the Red Sea, this futuristic, incredible city. Almost reads like a sci-fi, movie when you read the descriptions of what the Saudis are planning to do there. And all of this sort of forward-looking, attempt to bring the Middle East into an era of modernization and prosperity and away from conflict and away from religious fundamentalism and all the forces that have been holding this region back. So I think, maybe he's putting Egypt first because it broke rank. Egypt broke rank in the Arab Muslim world. But I think he's hoping for a lot more out of the Saudi normalization agreement.
Yeah, and interestingly, with regards to the Saudi normalization agreement and its relevance or its place in terms of some very daring peace initiatives undertaken by the states of Israel, or in which the state of Israel has been involved. We're oftentimes perceived as being a country that's permanently at war with anybody and everybody who wants to do us harm. But the fact of the matter is, as I've said many times, we're actually party to some of the most audacious peacemaking in recent history. When you think about Egypt, certainly, when you think about Jordan, when you think, of course, of the Abraham Accords, and now this mooted agreement or normalization agreement with the Saudis. But what's interesting about this normalization agreement, and where I connect it back to Egypt, Yaakov, is that it may actually be deleterious to our agreement with Egypt, because if the Saudis get their way and get their wish for a civil nuclear program, we're going to see the Egyptians want at least the very same, aren't we?
It's a very good point. It's a very important area of concern. Whether or not we get the Egyptians wanting the same very much depends on what the Saudis get. When it comes to, weighing up the pros and cons, I think there's a few general statements we can make. First of all, a certain amount of risk, in my opinion, is justified. In other words, the idea that no Arab country can get anything in order to preserve Israel's qualitative military edge, or to prevent a nuclear arms race, which of course is critical. We have to prevent a nuclear arms race in this region. But the idea that no Arab country can get anything that would threaten, either one of those ideals, I think is wrong. It's wrong because the trade-off could be far bigger and lead us to a much better situation than the status quo strategically. So I believe that a certain amount of risk is worth taking, should be taken in this grand maneuver. How far we should go, I think, the devil is in the detail. The Saudis want a nuclear program from the United States, and that would give them full control over the nuclear fuel cycle. And that's going much further than, say, what the Chinese can offer them, which is right now, as far as at least I'm aware, is a civil nuclear power plant. And the Saudis are looking to set up something that could, in the future, be turned into a military nuclear program. And that is risky. That is absolutely risky. Turkey could follow suit. Egypt could follow suit. Other countries could follow suit. The last thing we want is the world's least stable region being armed with the world's most destructive weapon. Of course, we don't want that. But if the Americans find a way to supervise the Saudi program into the long term and to not give them control of, say, uranium, but to give them a civil nuclear program with Israeli input into how that would look like, then I believe that this risk can be managed. And the same is true regarding, the Saudi ask of an F-35 fleet, and the same is true of other Saudi requests. I think these requests have to be taken very seriously, because the idea of this ultra-conservative clinging to the status quo, I personally think it's wrong. I was essentially opposed to the idea that the UAE could not get the F-35. I think the UAE could get the F-35. I don't think we had to lose sleep over the UAE being armed with F-35, because those F-35s are supposed to be dealing with Iranian threats. So why shouldn't we have more countries that are able to deal with Iran? And the flip side of that, and people will say, well, what happens if there's a regime change in the UAE? And it's a fair comment, but when was the last time, a Gulf monarchy experienced a regime change? I don't recall in a very long time, if at all.
We have had massive ruptures in the Arab and Muslim world. I mean, I don't need to remind you about the Arab Spring, obviously.
Absolutely. But if you look at where the Arab Spring happened, it did not happen in these Gulf monarchies. It didn't happen there. So
it didn't, but it could do. It could. I think that's part of the concern, Yaakov, right? And you're mentioning that that's reason for concern.
Of course. And this is the overall risk assessment. I'm not saying that there's an obvious answer. What I'm saying generally is that we should be willing to take some risks to change the region, because a Saudi normalization agreement will transform the region. And the reason I say that is because, when you look at the Middle East, when you zoom out and look at the map, I'm pretty sure that somebody like Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, wakes up every morning and he looks at the map of the Middle East and he's saying, is this map turning, let's say, red, the color that I wanted to turn it? Are we influencing more and more countries? We're in Iraq, we're in Lebanon, we're in Syria, we're in Gaza, we're in the West Bank, we're in Yemen. These are all places where Iranian influence is very dominant to varying degrees. Or is it turning green? Are the Israelis and the Sunnis who are opposed to the Iranian vision of this revisionist Shiite Islamic fundamentalist empire surging in the region and washing away? This is the big question in the decades ahead. I've got a message saying that my internet connection is unstable, so if you're having problems hearing me, let me know.
Yeah, just repeat that last sentence, if you would, that last point that you made, because you froze for a moment.
So ultimately, I think that, we can divide the Middle East into Iranian zones of influence and Israeli/Sunni Arab pragmatic zones of influence. And I believe that somebody like Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, he gets up, I think, every day and he's looking at this map of the Middle East and seeing whether the Israeli Sunni Arabs bloc are becoming more influential, or whether the Iranian Shiite radical axis is becoming more influential. And it's this long-term contest that I think is going to decide the future of the region. So that's why I believe that we need to take some risks to make sure that Saudi Arabia firmly enters into the Israeli pragmatic zone, the pro-US zone, stays away from China, stays away from Iran, is stable, is economically prosperous. This is the main Saudi motivation here, is to become an economic, regional power, and that's able to defend itself, and that has American security commitments. And Israel can fit very well into that vision. So I think, when you're looking at the long-term future of this region, it's worth taking some risks to make that vision a reality.
Well, I appreciate what you're saying there, Yaakov. I would love to delve into that more, but we're a little bit constrained in terms of our timeline today. Let's talk about something else. Prime Minister Netanyahu has just arrived on the West Coast. He's going, of course, for a meeting with Elon Musk, and then he's going to be traveling to the East Coast, and he's going to be addressing what I believe is the most international podium astride the globe today, which is the United Nations General Assembly. What do you expect him to say there?
I think he's going to be talking about the alarming developments regarding Iran. Iran has just basically ruled out a third of the IAEA's inspectors they banned them from carrying out inspections. This looks like it's a response to a move made by Britain, France, and Germany to maintain their own embargoes on the transfer of missile and nuclear technology to Iran, even though this missile embargo this month, I think in just a few days, is becoming expired. So this is a, calculated move by Iran saying, whatever you do against us, we've got something up our sleeve against you. But really the problem is that Iran has become a nuclear threshold state. I think this is the main problem, and it's important, I think, to underline the strategic gist of the situation and not get lost in all the details. Iran has become a strategic threshold state. I think Netanyahu is going to be underlining that very alarming fact. The international community seems to be pretty docile about that reality. The United States appears to be doing everything it can to avoid any scenario of confrontation with Iran and going towards diplomacy as the automatic go-to to deal with any crisis involving Iran. And the European and British move to maintain embargoes should be commended. Absolutely. I think that's very important. And Israeli leaders at the conference that you attended, the ICT's conference, were issuing calls for other countries to do the same. So it's not all bleak, but we have an Iran that's a nuclear threshold state that's sending out tentacles throughout the region. And also conventionally, their arms industry is now affecting other parts of the world. Iranian UAVs are crashing into Ukrainian cities. Who would have believed that a year and a half ago? And Iran is trying to get missiles over to Russia to fire at Ukraine. And interestingly, the Mossad chief, David Barnea, mentioned that some of those deals were interdicted. He didn't say how. So we're seeing Iranian influence spreading even far beyond the Middle East and in Latin America as well. And I think this is a problem and a threat to international security that the international community does not take seriously enough. And Netanyahu is going to try and change that. The problem is that he has been issuing this warning for so many years. So people, around the world who don't follow these issues will be asking, well, what's new? There is a lot new, but they won't be aware of it. And his domestic crisis, our domestic crisis, is going to overshadow much of his messaging. And those are the issues that he's going to be struggling with, I think, in the next few days.
So given that all of these things have happened, and Benjamin Netanyahu has repeatedly really sounded the alarm from the United Nations General Assembly, and quite frankly, from any and every platform of significance that he can reach, he has repeatedly sounded the alarm of the mendaciousness and the dangers of a nuclear-armed Iran and its approach toward that status. And yet all of these developments have occurred. All of the developments that you just mentioned, it now becoming a threshold nuclear state and more. And it begs the question, really, who's he speaking to when he says all of this? What's the purpose here? Who's he trying to influence? Who's he going to make an impact upon that he hasn't already made an impact upon? Whose mind is he going to change? And is speaking about Iran in such a public forum so often, in such a repetitive manner, and I don't mean that dismissively, but it is repetitive, is that really a sound policy, or is it time for him to perhaps adopt or adapt his policy and adopt more of a code of silence, of saying little and doing much?
So I don't think that any Israeli leader should be silent on Iran simply because of the magnitude of the threat and the fact that it is not static. And actually, in that respect, I would say that the Iranians have helped Netanyahu somewhat by basically taking sides in superpower struggles in a way that they never did before. They're, Russia's top supplier of firepower against Ukrainian cities. They are exporting greater amounts of oil, greater and greater amounts, I should say, to China. And China and Iran have this joint interest of minimizing American influence in the Middle East. So the fact that Iran is now taking sides globally in this new era that we're seeing, which is, the end of American superpower global dominance and the beginning of a new century of superpower competition between the United States, China, and Russia to a certain degree in its own unconventional way, means that Iran is going to be on everybody's radar anyway. So if Netanyahu, I think, tailors his messaging skillfully, he'll be able to essentially ride on that and points to the fact that he's been issuing these warnings, and now the entire world can see that Iran is such a destabilizing force, sending weapons in all the wrong directions, promoting conflict for its own interests, promoting war crimes in Europe. Again, it's amazing that we're saying this, that Iranian weapons are enabling crimes of war to take place and the targeting of civilians in Europe, in Eastern Europe. I mean, this is just the beginning. The Russians want to get hold of a lot more, and they're setting up a factory almost overnight. It's actually the Iranians who are setting up a factory on Russian soil to produce UAVs and likely missiles. They've sent them about 1,000 UAVs, and there's going to be a lot of efforts to provide them with a lot more. So global events are actually favorable for this message. And the target audience is the entire international community, because, in any case, the international community has to take sides in this global superpower struggle. The Americans are saying you can't sit on the fence. They're telling everybody this. You're either with us or with Russia. You're either with us or you're with China. And Iran has made its decision very clear. And those who deal with Iran like it's a normal country will have to think twice, because they're going to have to answer to the United States and to the wider West for their decision. So I think Netanyahu is actually well positioned to deliver a message. But again, the problem is that his entire messaging is going to be overshadowed by the domestic crisis, I should say. I'm so used to dealing with conflicts that I've introduced the word here, but it is a kind of a conflict of ideas that's tearing us apart here in Israel, and that is going to overshadow his message to a significant degree, unfortunately.
And yeah, Yaakov, it's interesting to draw a little bit of a parallel. As Benjamin Netanyahu travels onward towards the UN General Assembly, he's going to seek to rally the world to a particular danger that he has identified. He's been on the forefront of that, frankly, for decades, the Iranian nuclear threat. But as he does so, as he embarks upon that journey, as he begins to speak, you, of course, have a very considerable protest movement trying to rally the world to a danger that they see, which is the pursuit of judicial reform by this government helmed by Benjamin Netanyahu. And we actually see, and incidentally, I do not agree with many of the tactics used by the protest movement. I do not agree that military units ought to be protesting beneath the insignia of their military units. I do not agree that the military should have been dragged into this process at all. I'm very concerned that the genie cannot be put back in the bottle, and I think it's very worrisome, and I think that it's absolutely reprehensible that such a red line was crossed. But Netanyahu landed on the West Coast, and what did he see there? He saw an image beamed onto Alcatraz, the infamous prison there off the coast of San Francisco in the Bay Area, a symbol that said, "Welcome to Alcatraz, Bibi," with him behind bars. There are going to be massive and considerable protests outside the United Nations by Israelis in opposition to Netanyahu. It used to be that when the Israeli Prime Minister traveled to the United Nations, American Jewry would rally to his side and provide applause as and when he spoke, because the United Nations General Assembly is seen as so very adversarial towards Israel and to any Israeli Prime Minister. And it makes me wonder where all of this is going. We founded the MirYam Institute because we wanted to ensure a tone of civility when it comes to dealing with serious issues of policy, politics, defense within the State of Israel. And I'm worried that everything is deteriorating. Where do you see the public discourse going, Yaakov?
It all brings us back to Gallant's warning, doesn't it? I mean, this is exactly what Gallant was saying, that if we want to be relevant in the world, to have our messages heard, we have to internally get our act together. I personally am a short-term pessimist and a mid to long-term optimist. I think we're going to have a lot more trouble ahead in the coming, say, weeks and months. But I believe that a growing segment of the Israeli civilian population will reach the conclusion that it is not possible to simply run over other segments of the population, that we're going to have to find a way to work together, because we really have only one country and one society. And I think that that's going to translate itself, that realization, into the political system, one way or the other. And when that happens, I think that people like Gallant will be the ones who will say, who will guide the process. Those voices will be guiding voices to bring us back off the edge and bring us back towards what I call minimal level, what a minimal necessary level of national cohesion, national unity. These are all essential in order for Israel to defend itself, as we've said, and to be relevant in this new century, which is seeing, this superpower competition, which is seeing the region change from one way, edge to the other. So many things are happening technologically, geostrategically, militarily, and in order for Israel to be a leader in the 21st century, it cannot be at war with itself. And I think that this is going to be the realization that ends up guiding the country in the long term. So that's my personal view, my assessment. Short term, it's going to be rough, but I think we should hold out, not despair, because the inevitable conclusion, what I believe is the inevitable conclusion, will end up taking hold of the political system. I hope I'm right.
Yeah. Well, I hope you're right as well, Yaakov. I appreciate your time as always. I know that you do have to dash, so thank you very much for being with us. By the way, your internet needs a little bit of improvement. We'll talk about that offline, but I just mentioned that because our listeners, we will get that remedied. I'm absolutely certain of that. And I'm a near-term pessimist that we can get your internet, a near-term optimist, Yaakov, that we can get your internet fixed before the next show, rather. And I want to thank you, as always, for being a great interlocutor, having a great conversation with me, and taking the time to provide some context and insight, as ever you do, to our show today. Thank you very much indeed, and I look forward to our next briefing, which will come up in the coming days and weeks ahead. All the best, Yaakov. Be well.
Thank you, Benjamin. Take care.